It's Tim Sheets for TechSpot here, and this is the Oppo F1. Now, there's a lot of competition these days in the sub $200 phone market, and one of the phones that I keep recommending to people is the Motorola Moto G from last year. But when I looked at the spec sheet of the Oppo F1, which includes features like an 8-megapixel selfie camera, a Snapdragon 616 SoC, which is particularly impressive at this price point, and a metal body, I just had to check it out. There are some compelling features to the F1 that make this a decent budget device, and let's start with the design, which, as I mentioned earlier, is metal. Now, that's only partly true. There is one slab of, in this case, gold aluminium on the back of this device, but that is flanked by plastic at the top and bottom. Now, Oppo has clearly tried to make this plastic look the same as the metal by coloring it in a similar fashion, but I don't think this really has been pulled off. I do like the use of metal here. It gives it a premium look, but the fact that the plastic parts don't quite look the same as the metal detracts from the design somewhat. There's also plastic around the edges of this handset, which in this case also look like metal, and I think that it feels just a little bit cheap and more slippery than if it was made of actual metal. With that said, this handset does look quite a bit better than the 2015 Moto G, which mostly uses plastic, and I appreciate features like the slim body and also the squared off design. Perhaps the standout feature of the Oppo F1 is some of the hardware that the company has included, and this starts with the Snapdragon 616 SoC. Now, this is an octa-core part from Qualcomm, which is significantly more powerful than the Snapdragon 410 that we typically see in budget smartphones around this price point, particularly when it comes to GPU workloads. Now, this device does have just a 720p display, and the 616 is more suited to 1080p displays, which gives this quite a bit of a performance advantage in games. This device also comes with 3GB of RAM, which really helps make this device feel fluid in multitasking, and there's also typical features like Wi-Fi, Bluetooth and GPS, although unfortunately no NFC. Throughout my time with the Oppo F1, it definitely felt a step above the Snapdragon 400 and 410 devices that I've been used to, like the 2015 Moto G, and I think for people that want that extra little bit of performance, this could really be where the F1 stands out of the crowd. Where I wasn't as happy is with the display. It's just a 5-inch IPS LCD with a resolution of 1280 by 720, and that equates to a pixel density of just shy of 300 ppi. Now, I'm quite used to seeing 720p displays at this price point, and I don't have a problem with the resolution. It's more issues with the color quality that really let this display down. It's a couple of notches below the Moto G in terms of its color reproduction, and it's even slightly worse than devices like the Moto E, which are even cheaper than this particular handset. I was also disappointed with the brightness. This display simply doesn't go bright enough to offset the reflectivity issues that are introduced by using a white bezel, and sometimes this can make the display a little bit hard to view in direct sunlight. The feature that Oppo is heavily touting the most about the F1 is the selfie camera, and generally I was very impressed with what this 8-megapixel shooter with an f2.0 lens can do. It's quite a lot better than the Moto G 2015's 5-megapixel front-facing camera, and I was very impressed with how it performs in strong lighting and reasonably impressed with how it performs in low light. It's not quite as good as some of the selfie cams I've seen on flagship devices, but that's to be expected because those devices can be 2 or 3 times more than what the Oppo F1 costs. On the flip side, I wasn't as impressed with the rear 13-megapixel camera. It's only really good in strong lighting, and it falls well behind some of its competitors in the low or mid lighting that I think most people take photos in. The camera app as well is pretty much a direct rip-off of the iOS camera app, and some of the interface cues that they've used are quite confusing or simply poorly designed. I think that Oppo needed to place a little bit more work in the rear 13-megapixel camera than they did with the selfie cam. As important as selfie cams are, a lot of the time you'll still be shooting with that rear camera, and in the F1 it's a little bit of a letdown. Perhaps my least favorite aspect of the Oppo F1 is ColorOS, which is Oppo's skin that they've used atop Android 5.1. Now, for starters, Android 5.1 is quite outdated now. It's been 6 months since Android 6.0 has come out, and this device still isn't running the latest version of Android. That's a little bit disappointing, and I can't see Oppo, supporting this device in the future with things like security updates. ColorOS also tries to change a lot about the Android operating system, and typically it's for the worse. The changes to the visual design make it feel a little bit more dated than the current material design practices that Google's using with Android 6.0. The notification center changes can make it a little bit harder to read notifications at times, and there are annoying duplicated apps which we're seeing all the time from OEMs. If you're trying to open something like a link in an app, you'll have the choice between Chrome or the stock internet browser, which can be very confusing for end users. And really, I don't think Oppo should have placed any time into making these alternative apps because they don't really add anything to the user experience. There also aren't a lot of really compelling new features that Oppo has added into the software. There's only maybe one thing to highlight, and that's some of the notification permissions that you can change. But overall, there's really not a whole lot to like about ColorOS, and I really wish that Oppo would have simply put stock Android in this device. It would have made it a lot better and make it a much stronger competitor to the Moto G, which essentially uses stock Android. The final thing to talk about is, of course, battery life, and there is just a 2500 mAh battery in this device, but I typically found it to be quite good during general use, typically around the same level as the Moto G 2015, so there's no complaints there. So would I recommend the Oppo F1? And I'd have to say it depends on the region you're in, because the pricing for this device can fluctuate quite a bit. In Europe, for example, the F1 retails for about the same price as the 2015 Moto G, and I typically think the Moto G is a slight notch above the F1 in terms of its overall quality, thanks to improvements to the display and the rear camera. In the UK and India, it's even worse. The Moto G 2015 in its 16 gig model is quite a bit cheaper than the Oppo F1, and of course Oppo doesn't even sell this device in the United States, and I typically wouldn't think it's worth importing at the price point that some people are selling it at. But that said, there are some regions where the Oppo F1 is incredible value, and that is in places like Australia. Here, the Oppo F1 can be found for as low as 199 Australian dollars, and considering the Moto G can be $230 or $250, this really presents quite good value at the price point that Oppo is selling it over here. So it does depend on your region. If you find a really good deal on the F1, it's not a bad device, but I just tend to think that if the Moto G is the same or a cheaper price than this handset, it's probably worth sticking with what Motorola provides rather than what Oppo provides in the budget space. So I hope you guys enjoyed this review of the Oppo F1. Don't forget to check back on TechSpot.com, where we've got full and detailed analysis of this device. We'll be back on this YouTube channel with more video reviews shortly, so don't forget to hit subscribe and like this video if you liked it. Thanks guys, this has been a TechSpot video review.